Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. This week we're going to be talking about wax and how to use that on your pottery. Primarily I'm going to be going over wax resist. If you have never heard of it before, it usually comes in a little paintable container like this. It's not always by Mako, that's just what I'm using. But you can get it from just about any sort of pottery or glaze distributor. You can also end up melting down like actual wax that you find in stores and using that. It doesn't always work as well because this is kind of watered down for you to be able to paint it in a way that's similar to regular paint. So if I open this up, you are going to see that it is quite liquid. You do want to make sure that you are careful with this because if you get it on a surface that you don't want it on, it could totally ruin your whole day, because it's very hard to get off. The only way that I've ever really found that it works getting off well, and even then I wouldn't say well, probably not a great adjective for that, is using a torch. So if you are new to this, be cautious and maybe have a torch or, you know, like a lighter, something that provides heat, because melting wax off is really the only way that I've found to be helpful in this process. We are going to talk about a couple of different ways that you can use this. A lot of people, and probably the most typical way, will use this to paint the bottom of their pots so that way it doesn't stick to the kiln shelf. So we have a couple of pieces here that I'm going to be kind of demonstrating and talking about, you know, the process of going through this and how that works. So let's go ahead and get painting. All right, so we have our wax resist, we have our paintbrush, and I have my little spoon rest that I want to wax resist the bottom of first. Now, always remember you want to make sure that, you know, because this is so liquid, that you get all the excess bits that like want to dribble off into your container before we start. It's always better to be safe than sorry, and wax tends to go quite a long way. You really don't need a whole lot of this. It's just gonna get like a nice like glaze over it, and it will be noticeable like even when it dries that it has wax on it. So for the most part, this dries pretty fast. You can definitely see the difference between what has wax and what does not. So if you find that you get it in a spot that you don't want it, like I said, go ahead and take a butane torch or some sort of lighter, heat gun. Always be careful, you know, be protective of yourself and don't get too close to your piece because pottery is great at conducting heat. But that is how you would want to melt off some wax. I would say preventative care is better, and hope you just don't have to get to the point where you are trying to save your wax mess. Now that this is good to go, I'm gonna go ahead and put my wax aside for now. And we are going to paint. So I have this nice glacier blue color, also from Mako. And we're just gonna paint this whole thing blue. Now I wanna show you what it's like when you paint over wax resist, because it doesn't just not go on it, you know? Like, I can paint technically the whole thing. We'll wait for this to dry. The thing about it is it doesn't stop glaze from getting on this or sticking to it, but it just makes it a lot easier to clean this up. So instead of, you know, having to scrub, you can just take a light brush, and it's going to be very obvious to know where that wax sat on your pot, because that was way easier than doing your whole little scrubbing to get all of the glaze off of the bottom here. And I could do this again with another coat and it would still end up being the exact same way. So it is quite nice in that fashion. We'll go ahead and put this piece aside and I'll show you a different technique on a different pot. Next, I have this Barnacle Planter, and I want all of this to be kind of a blue color except for this starfish. I'm gonna make this purple. So we're gonna go ahead and make this purple first because the majority of the color is going to be blue, and this is really the only thing I want different. So we will go ahead and paint that. All right, so I just jumped over the part where I paint this and I glazed my starfish purple. So this can be a really good technique for layering colors and also just saving you a lot of time from painting around all the small parts, especially with paint on glazes where they need like 2 to 3 coats in order for them to show up well. Whereas wax resist can offer you a 1 coat and done solution. So since we now have our sea star painted, we're gonna go ahead and cover that with wax resist, considering on the rest of this blue. You do wanna make sure that your glaze is 100% dry, because you don't wanna be mixing glaze with your wax and wax with your glaze, because especially if it is one of those ones that takes a bunch of coats, you don't wanna be mixing wax with your top coat, because essentially it's just going to cause the top coat of glaze to just come off. So we're just going to be really careful, and this is more of the part where you want to be scared about like getting your wax on parts that you don't want, just because it's no longer the bottom that you're messing with, it is now like the detail work. We want to make sure that we really get our brush nice and not so dribbly, and we're just going to go over our starfish. And just being really careful not to get this on spots that we don't want it on. So I think that is good for the wax. Now with things that are a bit more textured like this, you want to make sure that your wax fully dries before we go over this again, because once again, we don't want our wax mixing with our glaze. So because it's kind of got these little divots in it, it's gonna take a little bit longer for it to dry. So we're just gonna go ahead and wait for it then. All right, my wax on my starfish is totally dry. So let's go ahead and layer on the blue. So I got my blue color here, and we're not even gonna care about where it gets, because the whole point of this was that I don't have to worry about making sure that I don't get any extra glaze on the place that I don't want it, which would be the starfish. We're just gonna go over, and just for the sake of this not being a whole video of watching me glaze, now we have our blue glaze around it, and you can see it's still on top of the starfish, but it's going to be a very easy cleanup. Now things that are a little bit more textured like this might be, again, a little bit more difficult to clean off just because there is the ridges there, but for the most part, it should come right off. And even if you don't completely get this off, like entirely, because the wax resist is under there, it will end up coming off in the firing because it's gonna want to scatter. I do want to note that because it is on the side that it does that, and if it's like inside of something, if you, like with my spoon rest, if you did your wax resist on the bottom, you still want to make sure that you get most of that off, because the thing about it is with this, it's going to want to disperse. If it's underneath something, it really doesn't have a whole lot of room to move. So odds are it's probably gonna end up on your kiln shelf, and you don't want that. This can be a really awesome tool for layering color, and I could do this with the blue again and, you know, add something else on top of it if I wanted like white or something else for these like little barnacles to stand out a bit more. We could also do that. So there's a lot of ways to do this. One last way I do want to note, and it's not about layering colors or a finishing design, but wax resist is also used to help prevent cracking. So because it does end up kind of covering a surface, it is really good for keeping moisture in and keeping moisture out. So if you are rehydrating something and you don't want, you know, a certain part of it rehydrated in the greenware stage, go ahead and put wax resist on it, and you can go ahead and spritz whatever spot you want. I wouldn't suggest, you know, rehydrating something that's like that dry, because like I always say, clay doesn't like to rehydrate, it likes to disintegrate. But if you must rehydrate something and you don't want a certain part of it, you know, say it is a connection point between like a handle and a pot or some sort of connection point, go ahead and hit that with some wax resist, so that way that doesn't want to rehydrate and crack off. The other way around is you can put this on something that you want to dry out really slowly. So if you have a piece that you are worried about cracking in the drying, go ahead and put a layer of wax resist on it. It will help to keep the moisture in, so you are going to wait a little bit longer, or want to wait a little bit longer until you fire it, until it's totally dried out, because it's going to take longer because of this process. But it is really awesome for being able to kind of hold in moisture, so that way for things that you have spent a lot of time on, this is just kind of a surefire way that it's not gonna crack on you. But one more thing I do want to note is you can also use any sort of like paraffin wax or soy wax and basically melt it down and use it with a basically a paintbrush, you do want to be, you know, careful that you are using it while it's still hot. It may end up destroying your paintbrush, so I wouldn't use anything that you like, but you can end up using that to kind of paint on spots. It's not gonna be as great because it's not gonna have the like liquidity of a wax resist bottle that's meant for that, but it is a much cheaper way to do it. So if you are on a budget, that is a great way to do it. And I used to do this at an old studio that I had, but essentially if you have a hot plate and not one that's just like a flat coil, but one that usually has like an actual like basin for your water or your food to sit and heat up in, you can also melt down like any sort of like wax cubes or bricks that you get from the store. And what I used to like to do a lot was I would melt down a brick of wax. I would just get Gulf wax from like Safeway, and I would melt it down so that way there'd be about literally like 1/4 of an inch just covering the bottom. And what I would do is I would just set each pot into the hot plate just for a second and then take it out, and then you'd have a perfect line around the entire pot of the glaze that's not going to touch the bottom. So that is a really awesome way to use that, really cheap, and usually get an old hot plate from Goodwill or somewhere, usually by you if you like thrifting. That is all I have for this week. I do hope that this video was helpful for you, and if you go ahead and end up, you know, using this video to create something of your own, I would love to see it. So you can always go ahead and tag me in any social media, or just leave a note in the comments. If you like this video, go ahead and hit like, subscribe, and I will see you all next week. Thank you for watching.